All right, everybody, I'm going to call us together because it's a 9:32 or something like that.
So, yeah, it's too cold
And Anne-Marie has a little announcement she'd like to make to start us off this morning.
I just wanted to say a lot of thanks to Don Heiser who brought the refreshments this morning. And I want to say that we have no refreshments for next Sunday. If anyone, and the next Sunday before Christmas, I'm going to be away, so I really hope someone signs up. Next week I can bring them, but the weekend after, as we get closer to Christmas, it would be, if someone feels that they can, it would be great. Otherwise, we'll make some sort of arrangement. We don't want to go without goodies. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. How's everyone this morning? We're looking very Advent-y, very purple. Yeah, blue. I see some blue. That's great. Hi, Sandy. You can sit wherever you want. So I noticed last week, I'm going to kind of go back and do what I should have done last week. Because it's hard to talk about this particular passage from Isaiah without having a little bit, just a teeny bit, of background on where Isaiah was, not only geographically but emotionally, writing when he was writing this particular oracle. And I thought that would help us when we go forward into today's section on Mighty God. So if you weren't here before, we're using this little book, this little study, Names for the Messiah. Hi, come on in. I know, it's package drop-off. I get it. Are you from UPS?
Not brand.
You got a bright colored jacket.
Come on in. If anyone needs this, let me know, but you'll just really need it for discussions today. And I have a handout of what I'm going over with us today that I'll give out later on. So the book of Isaiah, as we know it in the Bible, was written over probably 3 centuries. And think about that and how much change we've experienced in our own lifetime. So a book that was put together, edited, and written over, hello? I feel like I'm at home alone. 3 centuries worth of writing by probably more than 3 authors. This particular passage that we're using and studying was written by a person we call First Isaiah. So it's in that first section of the book. The book's divided roughly into 3 sections. Chapters 1 through 39, then 40 through 55, which scholars call Second Isaiah, and then 56 through 66 was written at a much later period in Israel's history, and we call that Third Isaiah. So our Christian expectation of the Messiah has been heavily influenced, as I said last week, by Handel's interpretation of First Isaiah, right? Particularly in chapter 9, this oracle, verse 6, for a child has been born for us, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders, and he's named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And then we looked at this question of what is a counselor. And we said it was he in that time, one who counsels or advises, but also puts into practice policies and plans for governing. And it's that particular focus that this oracle has in mind. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 14, the duties of a counselor are described as being related to the gatekeepers in the temple. you had to be chosen for that job, and many of the gatekeepers were also considered good counselors. They were judicious in their governance and their care taking of the temple. When we think of that today, I think we have this image in mind of the temple, like the Jewish synagogue up the street. The temple was a massive, massive complex. It just spanned miles. So when you had a gatekeeper, you had many, many, many gatekeepers, right? And particular ones were considered good counselors. We said to be successful, human counsel must coincide with God's counsel. So there's a convergence there. In Proverbs, we have this verse from Proverbs 21, no wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. So even the best of human counsel is no match for God's wisdom and counsel. So let me just say a little bit about first Isaiah and put it in context for us, and then we'll get into this idea of mighty God. Isaiah was one of the writing prophets, and that was a group that came into being around the second half of the 8th century BCE, before the Common Era. So that was a little while ago, right? About 750 BCE to around 500 BCE. And the writing prophets were mainly concerned with the life story of Israel. We all have a life story, right? A belief that kind of undergirds the way we live our lives. And this was the story of Yahweh, God, leading Israel from Egypt to Zion and establishing the Davidic dynasty, the kingship. And they believed that that story, that narrative, was no longer true for people who were living their lives at that time. And they based that on the fact that people were not living righteous lives and acting justly toward one another. That's a pretty bold statement for someone to make. And if you know anything about the prophets, they were always in trouble. You didn't want to be a prophet, in other words, because it's not as if you were making great predictions about the future, but your role was to say to people, listen up. You know what? If you guys don't straighten up and start living the right way, this is what's going to happen. Basically, they would lay out what they saw happening to a group of people if they didn't correct their actions. And that was very much Isaiah, Jeremiah, that was their role. And not only did they say it orally, they also made sure it got written down. And that's why we call them the writing prophets. Kingship was the central political institution in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, we already recognize this institution of kingship. If you look, I don't know if anyone has their Bible with them, in Genesis 14, we have a whole laundry list of kings who were fighting with one another over property and land, and who had the power and authority to rule. The book of Judges is essentially an argument for the institution of kingship, and implies that only a king is capable of maintaining social order. The books of Samuel give the people what they want. Samuel is in an argument with God about whether or not people should have a king, right? Israel keeps asking for this king. And Samuel, keeps saying, oh God, that's not going to work out. And finally God says, give the people people what they want. They want a king, let's give them a king and see what happens, right? So this idea that a human king is capable, and only a human king is capable of ruling justly in concert with God, starts to get into this notion of who a Messiah should be. The Jews who were interpreting scripture when the institution of kingship then finally wanes, studied all these texts about David and Yahweh, God, who were the ideal human kings, David was, and the ideal divine king. And then they sort of combined those ideas together with their belief about the Messiah, who will come. Looking always forward to that day when the Lord will become king over all the earth. That's in Zechariah. So biblical kings had tremendous authority in the political structure. And there was this kind of tripartite, this threefold form of government, like we have, but it had to do with royal, priestly, and prophetic power. The prophet was an important person in government. The king would call upon the prophet to give him a word about where he saw things going. And if he didn't like it, then he would call the priest, right? So there's always this kind of system of checks and balances going on. But to be a king meant more than just being maybe a really good prophet or a really good person who's right with the Lord. You had to have a quality of divinity about you. You had to be immortal. People believed their kings were immortal. You had to be wise. You had to be wealthy. And you had to be physically perfect. And that's why David, with all of his foibles, kind of grew into his kingship and became, in the people's vision, this ideal, king. At the time first Isaiah was writing, the people were engaging in idolatrous worship, Baalism. So Baal, the god Baal, there were many little Baal statues people would have all over their houses, right, and engage in worshiping those. An unjust conduct. And that unjust conduct had mostly to do with ownership of land. So at the time, land was handed down familially from one generation to the next. And people were coming along and taking what wasn't theirs. So if you thought, as the firstborn son, that it was your right, and it was, to inherit your father's land, and someone living next door came along and made an offer, unbeknownst to you, and kind of took over your father's property, and you didn't find that out until your father died, and you lost your inheritance. We have many stories about that in the New Testament. You're out of your land. It was an unjust deal, and this was going on all over the place. So that's called patrimonial domain. You can read about it, and Isaiah writes about it in the 5th chapter. So a lot of families lost their land that they believed didn't just come from their fathers before them, but was a gift from God. So not only was it a human injustice, it was a divine injustice, right? Also at this time we have Assyria knocking down the doors on Israel's border, Israel is a little, it's like David and the giant, right? It's a little, not even a country as we think of it, almost a community unto itself. And here comes this superpower, Assyria. They can't put up any kind of a fight. And so they find it the best route to take is to kind of coexist, right? The prophets saw attempts by Israel's kings to forge alliances with neighboring states and or Egypt as distrustful of God's power to protect his own city and king. And it was doomed to failure, they thought. So the king sees Assyria coming. He calls the prophet in for a word of counsel. The prophet says, you have to trust in God, that God will take care of this situation, will give you wisdom to deal with it. And the king says, thank you very much, goodbye, and makes his own deal with the Assyrian powers, right? And basically, when we were talking about Hezekiah last week, that's what happened with Babylon. Okay? So that old tradition, that storyline about Israel, the people will dwell securely in their land under Yahweh's protection, the prophets thought was no longer valid. It just didn't hold water anymore. It couldn't happen. They were under too much threat and assault, and the prophets were not listening to God, or the kings were not listening to God. So, all of these things converged. The conduct resulted in divine judgment. The primary meaning of judgment in biblical terms is to govern or to rule. So biblical judging or ruling establishes the justice God intends for the world. And divine justice corrects injustice and unjust situations. To judge a situation was to rectify it, to make it better, to bring it into conformity with the divine will. Divine judging doesn't have to wait until Judgment Day, at the end of time. It happens within the context of history as things are playing out, and uses human beings to bring it about. So for Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the great empires of the day were instruments that God was using to work out divine justice. Assyria, Babylon, Cyrus of Persia were the superpowers of the day. And somehow God would use them to work out his justice in the world. That's how the prophets believed salvation came to people. Through God's mysterious work. The job of the prophet was to prepare people to respond to that process of God's judgment. And that's what Isaiah, our friend, is trying to do here. The book of Isaiah, from start to finish, contains that entire process of judgment. When we talk about denouncing the sin of the people, some kind of breakdown of the system, destruction, war, chaos, and then restoration. If you read the third Isaiah, 56 to 66, that's where that word of restoration comes to Israel. Three major themes in this first part of Isaiah then are condemnation of Judah and Jerusalem. And if you look at this little map here, your handy dandy visual aid, we have, this is very simplified, but it shows you the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah at the time Israel was divided, right? So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about northern and southern kingdoms, Judah and Israel. So we've got this theme going on, condemnation, and then later salvation, how salvation will come to Judah and Jerusalem. We have this theme of Zion as the ultimate city, and the Davidic king, the line of kings who will rule, and Assyria as the Lord's instrument. Even though it seems like a superpower is going to come in and destroy Israel, no, it will be a servant of the Lord somehow. And that brings us to this idea of mighty God that we read about this week. So royal titles from this oracle that Isaiah wrote were taken up by the early church as a way to bear witness to Jesus. On Friday in Grace Place, I used a term that we use sometimes in speaking about children who are born, right? And sometimes we talk to our kids and we say, you know, you weren't even a twinkle in your father's eye when that happened. And I said, when Isaiah was writing, and I just used that euphemism, Jesus wasn't even a twinkle in God's eye for these people, right? And of course, Sandy says to me, well, is there ever really a time when Jesus was not a twinkle in God's eye? I said, okay, theologically speaking, no, there was not. However, for the sake of human argument, I'm going to say when Isaiah was writing, was he writing this with Jesus specifically in mind? No. He's addressing it to this context that's going on here. Does he believe as a prophet that there is a Messiah coming? Yes. Does he know that it will be Jesus, the Christ, that we consider the Messiah? Not at that time, I don't believe. But perhaps that's an argument in name only. I don't know. I'm not that smart. So, we in our early founding of the church believe that this oracle was the way and the wording that bore witness to Jesus. But how do we articulate who Jesus was in relation to God? Volumes have been written on this topic, right? We have all kinds of doctrine. We have church doctrine. The early church fathers went to many councils to try and answer this question. The Council of Nicaea was all about that. And by the way, if anyone can tell me what it means to be begotten, I would love to know, because we use that language in our creeds, and we just say it. But I think we don't really think about what that means, right? Begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, from whom all things are made. Does that mean? So we have this idea of divinity, divine. One who's infused with divine power, but power that belongs to God. So if we believe the king was in some way divine, he gets his power from God. And therefore, because he is divine, his realm has these characteristics. He will have victory in war. He will have economic success. He'll have agricultural productivity, which was crucial in an agricultural society, right? Everyone was dependent on that. There will be justice in social relations and economic justice toward the poor and needy. This is huge. If you're not treating your neighbor justly, if you're not caring for your neighbor, the poor, the widow, the orphan, you're not living the just life. The gift of blessing, however, still belongs to God. That is up to God. The human does not get to bestow that gift. The second quality of a king, mighty. The king must be brave, bold. He has to have some military prowess. So the king is the commander-in-chief, right? The king commands the armies. Jesus has extraordinary power and authority, but there's a lot of resistance to identifying him as God, especially when he's born and as he grows in wisdom and assumes his authority and leadership. In the Gospel of John, it takes Thomas how long to finally say, oh, my Lord and my God. He finally gets it, right? So there's an acknowledgement of Jesus' divine power and character. But this question Isaiah is raising has to do with power in a world organized around the power of Rome. If you're living in that time and Rome had authority, what does power mean, right? In John 18, we have this Jesus saying, my kingdom is not from this world. He says his power is not grounded in coercion or violence, but in the will of God, whose intention is not what Rome's is. I think we confuse that sometimes, and we want to make it more mystical than it is. Jesus there is simply saying, my power, this power that I have, is not this power to command armies and to lead the nation into war and to stand up against superpowers. My power comes from God to ensure that everyone in the world will be treated justly. His power transforms, it makes life possible for everyone. And then we have these gospel stories, like we have in Mark. The man with the unclean spirit. The spirit is helpless before Jesus' power, his divine authority. We have the storm at sea. Jesus is out riding in the boat asleep. Everyone else is panicking. He says, be still. That's his power. And Jesus contains the forces of chaos and death. And all of his opponents are agents of death, especially Rome. Jesus forgives, heals, redeems, crowns, and satisfies. But it's not about his title, king or Messiah. It's about how he does things and what he does. And then he goes and turns around and invites everyone else to follow him and to transform people's lives like he does. He commissions them to heal the sick. The demons submit to them. When the disciples go out, and Jesus has given them the power to go out just as he does, they're surprised, I think, to discover that they have the same power and that they're capable of healing demons. There's another UPS man. So it's a shock to learn, maybe, that when you follow, you're the inheritor, not of land, but of this power to act justly. And that's what the early church's inheritance was. They're entrusted with this power of this mighty God who gives forgiveness, restoration, and well-being to the world. I'm going to give us a few minutes to look at our discussion questions. And I just want to say a word before I leave you about Northern and Southern kingdoms, because I think we don't understand our history really well here. This is a short version. So the kingdom of Judah, which is this little yellow piece down here, came about from the breakup of the United Kingdom of Israel. We think about 1020 to 930 BCE. After the northern tribes refused to accept Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, as their king. So you have this, again, kingship. Solomon, we know, was this wonderful, wise counselor, wise king, right? His son Rehoboam, not so much. So the people just couldn't fathom in their minds that this is Solomon's son, right? Because he didn't rule justly. At first, only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to him. And remember, this is the house of David descending. But soon after, the tribe of Benjamin joined Judah. So the two kingdoms, Judah in the south, Israel in the north, coexisted. That's what Israel does well. After the split, until the destruction of the kingdom of Israel by Assyria, around this time that Isaiah is writing, 722, 721. So finally Assyria comes in and there's this division. And the major theme of the Hebrew Bible is the loyalty of Judah and its kings to Yahweh, to God. They believe that is the God of Israel. So all kings of Israel and almost all the kings of Judah were bad, which means they failed to enforce this notion of one God, Yahweh, one God of Israel. The good kings, now this is an interesting refrain, like Hezekiah. Hezekiah wasn't all bad. He believed in one God. But it was that allegiance to that one God that cost him his kingdom. Okay. He didn't believe in Baal worship. He didn't believe in worshiping Asherah. However, down the road, he's succeeded by Manasseh, who was not the world's greatest king, of Judah, and Amon, and they did worship idols. And Yahweh became angry at this. Later on down the line, we have King Josiah, who says, nope, one God alone, we will worship only. But it was a little too late. God says, nope, too little, too late. And the kingdom is destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in 587. So all along the way, we have this tug of war with kings and what humans want and how they want to be ruled and what God would have happen in human history. All right, we have some time, and I want to, by the way, give a shout out to Jason, who is prepared to take over for me today. I thought I wouldn't be here but here I am. And Jason prepared a little presentation that will start next week. A little PowerPoint that will review some of this for us. So our questions for today having to do with what is a mighty God and how did Jesus present that way begin on page 76. And the first one I'll go over with you a little bit. Brueggermann says that all opponents of Jesus were agents of death. And that power from God is necessary. It requires enormous force to resist the power of death. And he asks you to name examples you can recall where Jesus resisted those powers. So that's your first discussion around your tables. And I might extend that even into today. What are the powers of death that surround us? And how do we resist those? Since we're not kings. So that's our question for today. Examples we can recall where Jesus resisted the powers of death. We can start out talking, and I'll bring these papers around. It might give you some things to start with.